you're going to be able to hear us all the way to the Hircha. So the review opened, is there anything Jennifer Egan can't do? Inquiring minds will say, quick, tell us something that you can't do, so that we don't all go home with a total complex this evening. Just to get things rolling. Tell us just one or two examples of something you can't do.
Well, I'm really terrible at writing about myself or people I know. I'm very mediocre at best at doing that. But unlike other challenges, I'm not that tempted to overcome that because I find it incredibly boring as well. So I have very little incentive. Everything I do starts out being something that I can't do. I guess what
also words to live by.
I mean, good. The downside is that I spend a lot of time in a state of extreme incompetence, but the upside is that by the time I finish, if I am able to, I have acquired some skills. But then there's another downside, which is that I generally want to do something totally different next time, so I can't actually use those skills.
Because you actually enjoy starting in the state of incompetence.
They're not portable, very sadly. What I want to do next, I think, is actually impossible. Which is to try to write a companion to A Visit from the Goon Squad using the same structural approach and some of the peripheral characters, but having nothing about time, nothing about music, and having it be its own thing and not an echo of the other.
So then you're not starting with time and place in this particular case?
Well, I am in a way because I have various times and places in mind.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're not going to give those things away, I guess, this evening. Now, you've talked a lot about research, and I think we just have to start there before we get into some of the juicier bits. It struck me, listening to you and looking at interviews and knowing you as I do, that you kind of do a Daniel Day-Lewis when you get into the research, the way he's reported to get into his acting roles, so for Gangs of New York, he actually worked as a butcher, and for his new one, he took up dressmaking. So we have here the bruiser of a woman that Jennifer is, trying on the 200-pound dress, the diver's suit, and hanging out at the Naval Yard and doing all of these interviews, and I think you were down with the police. What was most surprising? I know you thoroughly enjoyed the research, and she still has all of these facts at her fingertips, and the more you talk to her, the more you get, and the more you want to take notes. But what was the most surprising in all of this research?
I don't know if there was a most surprising. I feel like often the thing I took away from the experiential research that I did was the thing that I wasn't looking for. I mean, as one example, so trying on the 200-pound dress, you would think, well, that would really help writing about what it felt like to wear a 200-pound dress. In fact, I don't think you really have to try it on to imagine that. And in fact, I've never even scuba dived, and I have long scenes that take place underwater, so obviously I felt like I didn't have to do that to write about it. But what was really interesting is that every diver has two tenders, and the job of the tenders is to, first of all, dress the diver, because the suit is really more like a machine that has to be assembled around the diver. And then their job is to keep the diver alive. And every diver is also a tender for other divers, so it depends how often you've gone down, whether you're due to dive at a certain point or to tend. So I went to this reunion of Army divers. They have a very tight-knit veterans organization, and they meet every other year. So I had been talking to two guys who were Vietnam veterans, and they're really sweet, and they said, oh, come, and one of the things that...
This was in New York?
This was in Virginia. Okay. One of the things that they offer at their reunions is the chance for anyone who feels like it, any diver, to wear the old equipment and dive in a tank. And so they
had... You're taking volunteers later. You can sign
they had all the equipment there. So they dressed me in the thing, but what was so awkward at first was that it's a very intimate thing to be dressed by two men that you don't know very well. And I felt kind of awkward at first, and then actually rather comforted because the physicality of it was sort of domestic in its casualness. Mm-hmm. It felt ordinary and kind of comforting. I was being taken care of. That is literally the job of the tender. And so that was really something I hadn't expected or even thought about. And that ended up being kind of important in the book.
Yeah.
So those were the sorts of things that were unexpected. Another thing, I was involved in an oral history project with the Brooklyn Historical Society and the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and we were trying to interview people who had worked at the Navy Yard. Now, I'm a journalist, but I'd never done any oral history. And what I found was that I was being gently corrected by the real oral historian about my interview approach, which was very directive. I wanted to know about the Navy Yard, but she was trying to make me understand that an oral historian doesn't direct things in that
Just
way.
wants to listen.
You've got to just let the organic, the whole thing come out. And so I would sit kind of impatiently as she would be asking about, like, what they ate in their home, and I'd be thinking, but the Navy Yard, when are we going to get to the Navy Yard? But when I read the transcripts of those interviews later, often what was the most interesting were these little details of Brooklyn life, and she would get them talking about their
that hadn't been on
childhoods.
your list of questions.
Exactly,
right.
And so I think that, you know, a lot of times it was the thing I wasn't looking at that really ended up being useful later.
Yeah. That's wonderful. Now, you know, this book has gotten so many glowing reviews, and, you know, as I said yesterday, they truly are countless. So sometimes when you read a reviewer, it feels like you're just looking for something to pick at. And on the research side, there was a reviewer in The Atlantic who actually criticized you for having too much research, too many details, too much period speak. Which, you know, I think is one of the things that most reviewers just rave about because of the richness. How would you respond to that? Because you felt that you were drowning in the research a little bit yourself.
I think it's probably true. I think if I'd had 6 more months and could have read this one more time with a little distance, I would have probably pulled off a thin membrane of detail. I see it myself sometimes when I'm reading parts. I just think, it's a little geeky. Didn't
you call yourself a maritime nerd, actually, at one point?
But the thing is that I used to think when I would read books that had too much research in them that it was because people were showing off. But I think that I wasn't giving them the benefit of the doubt. I think the problem is that I felt so enamored of these details. They felt vitally important to me.
Right.
And so fascinating. Wouldn't everyone want to know? And I think sometimes that spell has to wear off a little, and only time can do that. I don't think it's a really bad problem, but I think
membrane is really.
I think
really
it probably.
nice.
I mean, sometimes when I say this to people, they say, "No, that's wrong. You could never do that." I think probably I could have, and that is kind of a bummer. But I think of it as kind of a rookie mistake because I had never written a historical novel before, and I think I would know now that there's just a little bit of, it is sort of like love. It's a blindness about the real world impressions.
Like, isn't everything about him wonderful?
Exactly. Isn't everything about a manually operated air compressor fascinating? Aren't you guys all interested?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
So I think it's probably true.
And, you know, we talked a little bit yesterday about some of the things that were most daunting for you in switching to this classic novel format. And I'd also like to know what you found most exciting or liberating about it, you know, because it is classic. Everyone else has done it. You had not yet done it, and you bring your baggage, of course. So, you know, were there things that you had learned long ago that you hadn't been able to use, or things that you were doing for the first time that were kind of exciting?
I think there were a couple things that were really fun. One was just frankly leaving small screens behind. I think we all crave that in our lives, and I think I was craving it in my writing, but I didn't know it. And in fact, I'm pretty obsessed with technology. So because there are small screens in the world, I'm interested in dealing with them. But it was very fun to move into a world where they didn't exist yet. There were big screens. Movies were so important, and very important, as I said before, in my kind of aesthetic thinking about genre. But it was nice to leave the screens behind. But I think that in a way, the corollary of that is the sort of equivalent of big 19th century history paintings. I felt like I got to do these huge dramatic scenes that are hard to find an occasion for in contemporary life. You know, and so like a shipwreck a
Right.
torpedoed ship, survival at sea, people getting murdered. In more fragmentary works, which is what I had.
You just wanted to dig up more bodies.
Well, who doesn't? But there's something, in works that are more fragmentary, there's a tendency for the action to happen off the page and for the fragments to be kind of suggesting that action
Right.
in a more glancing way. And that, I enjoyed doing that, but I really had fun getting in there and telling, in a way, what sort of ends up being more of an old-fashioned adventure story.
One of the other really fun things, at least for me as a reader, and I'm wondering, I have here like to steal a page from Jiffy Pop, were these as much fun to write as they were to read, were the good old-fashioned literary techniques. So I found myself on this kind of scavenger hunt of metaphors and similes throughout the book. And I'm just going to read a couple of examples because they're so juicy, and I could have picked, any of 100, but these are really worth reading out. So your description of Dexter Stiles, the gangster mother-in-law, Beth Berenger had the classic old stove's face, a drought-stricken delta of cracks and tributaries affixed to the reactive jaws of a Doberman. That's like a triple header right there. Or Dexter and Anna looked out at a ghostly procession of waves, like rows of people in white hats holding hands as they dove into oblivion. And of course, in a passionate moment, the dumb, blind part of his brain lunged forward like a hound at a fox hunt. These had to have been fun to write. I mean, they
were
sound
fun. I mean, it was fun to have an occasion to write that way, because
Right.
once again, that's a kind of style that is not always appropriate. And it's a little over the top, but somehow I felt like I
but
could
they're
kind of
perfect
I could
in
sort of
each
get away
instance.
with it in this context. Also, it was very fun to have at my disposal of imagery, things like a fox hunt, which you simply would not use in a contemporary
Right,
book.
right.
So it was a good challenge to have to look through the eyes of a person with a totally different set of references,
Right.
and imagine how they would see something.
Well, they sure were a lot of fun to read. And the other one of those is the turning points. There are a lot of very explicitly announced turning points in this book. And I wondered, and again, I can just give a couple of examples. I found myself just jotting them down, where characters either have this sense of movement or what's coming next or something in a relationship, and you point them out. So Eddie, the father, when he was a boy with Mr. De Veer, which is a very Dutch name, which struck me, the old man, that night Eddie lay sleepless, his whole body thrumming with certainty that something grand and new had begun. And he was right in a way, for much of what had happened in the years since could be traced to that acquaintance. Or Anna deciding to become a diver. As she returned their cutlery to the canteen, she felt a seismic rearrangement within herself. It was clear to her now that she'd always wanted to be a diver, to walk along the bottom of the sea. But with Dexter, something was going to happen. She and Dexter Stiles weren't finished yet. And there are a number of these from different characters, and I was wondering whether this too, was this a way of kind of leaving crumbs for us to follow or to stop and say what's happening, or was it more organic?
I think it was organic. I mean, it's funny, as you're reading it, I'm thinking, that's a little overdetermined. I should have pulled back on that. No, I
You
think
can't read anything to her. I mentioned her yesterday. She has likened herself to an abusive boss when dealing with her own writing. So I feel like I'm just not going to say anything else anymore.
No, I mean, I think it's just hearing them back to back.
These are gorgeous. These
but,
are all gorgeous, and they're all planted very discreetly in the
I don't think they're planted though. I think it's actually the opposite. I think it's the moment when I, as the writer, am following the impulse of the characters
Right.
to realize kind of what is important and what will come next. Those are the kinds of things I probably wouldn't plant. It's almost always the opposite, that I follow a clue into its fruition in whatever
Right.
way.
So really more organic. And something, there's one turning point here that just seemed to be so essential and so universal. There's a turning point in the scene where Eddie, the father, is losing Anna in spirit before she loses him physically in reality. And there's something heartbreaking and universal, as I said, realizing that his little girl, this garrulous sprite, has been replaced by the languorous, indifferent 14-year-old girl who wants only to get away. How essential was this scene as a setup to what's coming in the rest of the book? It just felt like everything had to stop when I read that scene.
You know, it's funny, that scene was not, I think that was actually one that didn't appear until later. When I started writing this book, my kids were still pretty young. They were not teenagers yet or even close. And I think it was only as they got older and I began to struggle with their pulling away from me that I understood that was sort of the missing piece in the actions of Anna's father, Eddie. I mean, he, as you may even have heard in the little part that I read, they have a kind of secret life together. She's sort of his accomplice as he goes about his business life, which is clearly involves, giving and receiving packages. Illegal funds of some sort. So he's taught her to be this kind of cipher-like secret keeper, but he is horrified when, as she gets a little older, this opacity, this secret keeping sort of turns against him, and he realizes, he senses, because he's sort of a detective by nature, that she's up to no good. But he also has no idea what's going on. This is a state that probably anyone in the room who is a teenager is somewhat familiar with. Mine are now just turned 17 and 15. But I think that was actually a case where, even though I don't write about my own life consciously, my own kind of feelings sort of filled a bit of a gap that existed in the story. And so I wrote that with great feeling, but at a slightly later point, feeling that it solved a lot of problems I was having in the narrative and actually explained a lot of things.
Yeah, because now it feels so essential looking
yeah.
back, and maybe you needed to. Now, I know it wasn't your intention to write a feminist book. There are a lot of strong female characters and women doing, amazing things better than the men. But you have some refreshingly feminist remarks and attitudes here from the male characters, especially. How did that come to be?
Well, right from the beginning, I mean, the part I just read you where Dexter Stiles says to Anna's father, they're stronger than we are. Luckily, they don't know it. That I remember writing that. That happened right in the first draft. So that was page 2 of the 1,400 handwritten pages I ended up writing. And it's sort of exactly why I use handwriting, because I remember thinking, I was sort of struck by that. Oh, he's sort of he's a feminist. He's sort of a proto-feminist. As it happens, he's a lot of unpleasant things as well. So I like that contrast. I was struck so often in reading lots of fiction from the first half of the 20th century and lots of letters and all kinds of things, at how language itself, it was so incredibly sexist. I mean, there was never...
Was sexist?
Well, I just mean in the sense that a human being was a man. That just went without saying.
Mankind.
Yeah, and when Anna finally sort of does join a team of divers, the lieutenant, the boss who loathes her and basically won't let her in the water, is always saying men do this, if a man does this. And that was so striking to me. But just the ways in which it took a really kind of agile mind to think its way outside of those constructs. And Dexter Stiles really does that.
Really does, throughout.
And I was interested in that aspect of him because he is, by any definition, a flawed human being. Being a crime boss is not necessarily
an aspirational.
You don't get a good service award for that job.
And the other thing, even the girls and the women, there are scenes I remember where, because at the time, and one might even say today, it's kind of the convention that girls or women are not allowed to be funny. This was before Amy Schumer kind of hit the scene in this book, but that she's aware of her being funny and her relationships, that there's also a little bit of a strain in there of strength. Like, yeah, you can be funny. You can be flirty, you could be funny, you could be strong, you could be all those things.
Yeah, although one thing that was really tricky, I knew that I don't think I'm giving, there are a lot of surprises here, but I don't think I'm giving too much away to say that Anna does eventually dive, having decided that she wants to, but getting her into the water was so difficult. And what made it hard is that I was determined, it was loathsome to me to create a sort of movie-ish narrative where, she passes the test and everyone says, oh, you're amazing.
Right.
Wow, who knew? I guess women are incredible. Life doesn't work that way. And so I kept having these encounters that I thought would lead to her being able to dive. But every time she was repelled from diving because I couldn't find any logic in the world that I was writing in and the characters I was dealing with that would lead to that outcome.
Yeah, but that's part of what makes it a page turner, right?
I finally
you keep
thought,
bumping up against it.
Is this going to be a book about someone who never dives? How can I get this woman into the water? It was such a challenge.
Concrete boots. And the last thing on this, and I'll leave it. Interestingly, in one of the richly written sex scenes, which we should maybe talk about in a moment, there is a real moment of #MeToo consent, right? The man says to the woman, I want to give away who it is, do you want this? And this was written way before, all of that #MeToo. Was that also a conscious, I'm going to make sure there's consent going on?
I think, first of all, I wanted to avoid, I guess, what I really wanted to avoid in a huge way, and in that scene also, was any sense of victimization. Because, not that there isn't plenty of it, and don't we know it, but I didn't find it interesting for my story. It just wasn't what I wanted to write about. It was not what this was about. So this felt, I guess it really speaks to the #MeToo moment that the sex scene is actually from the man's point of view. And especially because I was in his point of view and we're not hearing about her side of this at that moment, it felt incredibly important to me, and I guess to him, to make sure that everyone was on the same page at that moment.
Yeah. And let's just talk about sex for a moment while we're on it. So sex scenes are famously difficult to write well. There's apparently a whole debate going on now, actually, about how to approach sex scenes in serious fiction in this age of easy porn where, sex is basically everywhere. Apparently in the UK, there's even an annual Bad Sex in Fiction award. You, among many other things, do actually write sex scenes really well. And I was wondering, without getting too intimate here, if you could share some of your secrets for writing it. The writer, no, we're not going there. The writer, Jennifer Weiner, wrote, you try to make the way people behave toward one another when they're in bed line up with the way they behave when they're out of bed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. I would say, I think that more important than anything else is everything that leads up to it. I feel like if it's supposed to be sexy, and plenty of sex scenes aren't, then the question is, why is it? And that has everything to do with how those two people, if it's two people, got to that moment in that way. What is it that feels, inevitable and kind of compelling about this for them?
The hound at the fox hunt, I think was maybe.
So I think that's really, and then I think the other thing is really understanding how much to say. I think so often there's a weird mechanical impulse that kicks in when writers get to sex scenes. It's like, whoa, I don't think I need to hear all that. And in fact, it might be sexier if I didn't. Right. So I think it really may be a case where if you can, in a way, it's the same challenge that is true of all of fiction, which is, how can you say the least possible and suggest the most? That is the fiction writing enterprise in a nutshell.
Perfect.
Even in Search of Lost Time, a very long novel, if you think about all that it does and all the lives and years it encompasses, it's a fragment.
Still very condensed.
It's all about that, about a kind of synthesis, a sort of crystallization that refracts the enormity of not just the world, but our perceptions of it, which are so complicated. So that's all I'm trying to do, is just get us there in the right mood, the right spirit, and then say as little as I can and let the imagination do probably a much better job than I could of supplying the details.
Well, it really works. Let me take a break from my questions and see if we can open it up. I know that, not to leave everybody hanging on the note of sex here, but feel free to ask something different. But how are we doing this with the microphone? There are two microphones with people attached to them. Are there any questions so far? I can't really see. Otherwise, I can keep going and we can come back. Question here, yes.
I'm really curious about the colors of the cars. In the beginning, I had these cars. It seems like a very important thing to say something about the color.
The unusual names of the colors of the cars?
No, that you tell the color of the car. That you do it once, twice, I don't remember.
So what? I'm sorry. What's the question?
No, but why? Why is it so important to tell which?
Oh, well, the question is always who is telling us. Dexter Stiles is obsessed with cars. So he rarely describes a person or mentions a person without also mentioning what they drive. In fact, the colors of cars at that time were amazing, and they had remarkable names. It's sort of like, I don't know, makeup nowadays or something. Tawny beige, or they had amazing names. So it wasn't just, it was Niagara blue or Dove gray. And I actually, someone that I had helping me do some research found a website that actually had all of the paint colors of every car manufactured by year.
Wow.
There were a lot of yellow cars, and they were called like lemon meringue.
Yeah, those are only found in Florida these days.
It really reminded me of why you can, I don't even own a car, but why you can never find your car in America if you rent one, because every car looks exactly the same.
Yeah.
So Anna doesn't, if I'm writing from her point of view, we don't tend to hear much about car colors, but Dexter Stiles is really interested in them. And so when I'm looking through his eyes, I tend to give not just the model, but the color.
You would have subscribed to Car and Driver or something.
Yeah, and and in fact, at one point, I mentioned that, when he's recollecting his initial attraction to the mob, because he was not from a family that was involved in that at all, it was the remarkable car that this guy who would come to his father's restaurant and basically demand protection money was driving, that was so appealing to Dexter, in the sense that these guys drove great cars.
And of course, Anna's family car was owned by them and then no longer.
Right.
Which is hanging out there as a bit of an issue as well.
Exactly.
Other questions for now? Yes, over here.
Thanks, Jennifer. I was really curious if you could perhaps talk more about when you said you write, you try and turn off your conscious mind. And that's a very fascinating approach. If you could talk more about how you do that. I imagine you get up and you've got the kids, you've got to get them off to school, you get breakfast, and then you go into your room and you turn off your conscious mind and somehow swing towards the story or the characters.
Yeah, well, you've got the first part exactly right with the kids and the breakfast. Before kids, I would start writing almost immediately after waking up. And that, I think, was a great transition, because there's something very akin to dreaming about the sort of accessing of the unconscious that I'm trying to undertake. Now it's not that way, because I have domestic duties before. But I find that it's not so much about getting into the right mood before I start, because I almost never am in the right mood before I start. It is such, the perfect analogy is exercising. It really holds. So often, how often do you really want to go to the gym? Not that often. But do you ever regret it? So often I have a sort of feeling like, I'm not, I feel sluggish, I don't feel sparkly, but I just sit down and I start doing it. And I think that the actual act of handwriting for me has a sort of meditative quality to it. The fact that I can't read my writing is important because, you know, of course, you could say, well, typing has a meditative quality, but the problem is what you've got in front of you is what you're typing. That is problematic for me. Although as a journalist, I love it, and I'm kind of fixing everything as I go. But with fiction, that doesn't work because then I'm sort of pulled backward instead of hurtling forward. The faster I can go, the more likely I am to come up with something interesting and surprising because it's sort of a sign that the language is a little bit ahead of my thinking. So I like to have a feeling of, oh, yeah, okay, I like that. And certain aspects of people will come to me in that way. So for example, with my novel, Look at Me, there's a woman who thinks that she sees people's shadow selves. And what she means by that is sort of, she looks at a person and she sees the way they look, and then she thinks she sees the version of themselves that their persona is concealing. And I don't think that way. I've never had that thought. But when I wrote it, it sort of delivered her character to me in a really interesting way. And I felt excited. And that ends up being sort of an important part of her nature, not just in that it lets us see characters through her eyes in an interesting way, just as Dexter Stiles lets us see all kinds of cars, but that, in fact, she's, of course, wrong a lot of the time. So there's a gap between what she thinks she's discovering about people and the truth. So it gave me all kinds of opportunities and possibilities, and those sorts of leaps seem to come to me only in that more physically active but mentally quiet way.
Just quickly, while we're on your writing process, can you talk a little bit for you about the difference between storytelling and the craft of writing? Because you're obviously a master at both, but are there times in this book or in general that you feel that you're making trade-offs or sacrificing one or favoring the other between those two things?
That's a good question. I think they really go hand in hand. I mean, although there's a lot of trial and error in all of this. I mean, I write 1,400 pages, and that's not even the beginning. I mean, that's sort of like, you know, a huge...
That's still the nauseating, despicable, despairing first draft part.
It can be unpleasant to read in a typeface 1,400 pages written in that impulsive way, because there will be days where I just didn't have a good idea in my head, so I wrote 5 to 7 pages in which there's not a single interesting thing. So as you can imagine, reading that is really not fun. So there's a lot of shaping and sort of managing of what I do. And also, I should mention that I have a writing group that I really rely on a lot. And what we tend to do together is read aloud. And my question is often just, does the material feel alive? You know, sometimes it just isn't. And often when it isn't, it's a sign that my approach is wrong in some way. So for example, with Manhattan Beach, I thought I would be making leaps into the future in the book, much in the way I did in A Visit from the Goon Squad. I thought, well, look, this is a historical novel. It's taking place in the past. We're all in the present. I don't want to just pretend it's the past. That seems so, obvious or artificial. I want to wink at the reader and kind of share the knowledge that we're all in the present. And also, I had been kind of praised for doing that in A Visit from the Goon Squad, so I thought, people kind of like that. So every time I would bring anything into the writing group in which I did that, they went from sort of kindly suggesting that it wasn't working so well to getting angry with me and saying that they found it manipulative, and I mean they hated it. It was just not working. So that was a case where I was trying to impose a structural idea on material that didn't want that.
So that was the inorganic part of...
And it was a case of, I had a craft idea that was not in any way lining up with what I was trying to do. So those mismatches tend to show themselves pretty quickly.
So they get snagged.
They do, and all kinds of stuff has to be flushed out. I mean, for example, if I'm reading something I really like, that author's style will sort of, you'll start to feel some fingerprints of that in the parts that I was writing a first draft of while I was reading that person. But in the end, it's so obvious that they don't fit, and
Right.
and that gets flushed out too.
Right.
So it's
But that's part of the process too, isn't it?
yeah, it's certain things work and certain things don't, and on a kind of nuts and bolts level, that is simply what I'm trying to figure out and fix.
Right. Other questions from the group? Yes, one over here, up front. One back.
Yes, hello. I'd like to ask how students played a very important role in the story. Would you tell us a bit more about it?
Sure. The book is so utterly permeated by the sea. Water is kind of an obsession of mine, and it makes a pretty big appearance in most of my books, whether it's a moldering Gothic swimming pool in The Keep, which is a Gothic thriller, or other encounters with the ocean in other books. So in a way, when I started looking at pictures of New York and realized that the book was going to be about the waterfront, I felt a kind of happiness of just being able to really luxuriate in something that is always very tempting to me. I think some of that just has to do with where I grew up, because I'm from Chicago originally, which is very dominated by the lake, and then San Francisco, which is a peninsula, and not only a peninsula, but a peninsula full of elevations that remind you all the time that you're surrounded by water. One of the things that was amazing about writing about the sea and so delightful is that it's always both metaphorical and literal. I mean, so much of the sea and shipping still permeates our language.
Yes.
And so, and the sea itself is just so suggestive, metaphorically, that it was kind of a literary thrill to write about something that could be both all the time.
And his friend and foe also in the book.
Yes, both a sort of meditative object and, gigantic, deadly threat. Right. And I guess I really had a chance in this book to explore the sea from every side, from the shore, from the bottom, from the middle, and so it was. I felt happy to be able to do that. I felt like I'd been sort of edging around it, and this time I just, if you'll pardon it me, immersed myself.
Other questions?
There was one over there,
There
too.
was, yeah. Sorry, this one here first.
I really enjoyed all the detail in her book, and I really felt like I felt like I was in the historical moment. There was just towards the end, I was a bit surprised about this scene when Dexter insists on wearing a diving suit and going diving.
I just want to everyone should be a little careful about spoilers, because there really are some big surprises. Can we talk about it elliptically?
I guess I felt that there was a portion of the book where I suddenly felt like I was in a different story, because it was a bit not as realistic. So I didn't know if that was a conscious decision.
Well, here's the answer to that, because I struggled with that. It is totally realistic that would happen, and it does happen. The question is, someone who's never dived before ends up in a diving suit, the 200-pound kind, and walks on the bottom of New York Harbor, looking for a dead body. Now, I thought, oh my God, how can I, in the same way that I didn't know how to get Anna into the water, I thought, how can I make that plausible? First of all, why would the real divers want to undertake this illegal dive? And could someone who had never worn a diving suit wear it and dive? So I got on the phone, as I had an infinite number of times, with my diving contacts. And I said kind of tentatively to one of them and then the other. The conversations were almost identical. So this is what I'm hoping. I have this character. I want to get him into it. I'm just like bracing myself. And then these other divers who have a lot to lose, I'm hoping they'll assist with this illegal dive in New York Harbor during World War II. Do you think anyone would do that? And both of them said, hell yeah. Because divers tend to be kind of risk-taking people. They wouldn't be doing that work if they weren't. The fact is that often in the Navy and in the Army, men were put into the Mark V and put underwater immediately. And the goal was just to, it was literally a
This
kind
is
of,
the proverbial sink
it
or
was
swim.
sink or swim.
Right.
Can you hack it or not? As you
Right.
can imagine, some of them were totally freaked out and were flushed out of various diving programs. So it is completely plausible that he could do it. That doesn't mean it seems plausible, and my problem was that people think, as you did, that that's me, the writer, taking a liberty. I tried to shore it up as much as I could, but all I'm telling, so it's a kind of ironic problem of something that in fact is plausible, seeming implausible.
Well, we've also always got the thrill seekers that want to do. I mean, now we're sending non-astronauts into space, right? Just because we can, or just because that's an exciting thing to do as well. There was another question.
There's one here.
There's one here, one
And
here.
I was wondering if you could tell us some more about Anna's sister, Lydia. Why did you make the choice to for her to be as she is? I mean, she's this strange, enigmatic girl just lying in the room, not communicating. Somewhere there is this strange inner world in her. Why the choice for someone like that?
Well, as with all of the characters, it doesn't really feel like a choice. She kind of appeared immediately in that form. And I really thought, I don't think I want to write about someone like this, because first of all, she's a person who had certain injuries at birth. It's never exactly clear. I don't diagnose her. But it seems that it's probably some sort of cerebral palsy, and she cannot speak, and she also has very little motion. She can't really hold herself up. And so I thought, first of all, that's a potentially very undramatic character. I mean, this is a character who can't, interact in a compelling way, potentially. And there's the danger that someone like that becomes sort of a prop and not a character with real dignity and agency of his or her own. So I kept thinking, I think I have to find a way to do this without her. But interestingly, she was just inextricable right from the beginning. It was impossible for me to imagine the book without her. And as I kept writing, I understood more why that was true, because in many ways, although she is herself kind of a still point, much of the story revolves around her, and as a somewhat mysterious and enigmatic person, she is an object of projection for a lot of other people, and also division within the family, because the two parents react very differently to her state, and that is very much what kind of drives apart their marriage. As I was writing about this person, I knew that at some point I would want to enter her consciousness in some way. And I looked forward to that, and I think that was probably one of the high points of the writing process for me. So
She also brings out a whole side to Anna's character that you wouldn't otherwise see.
yeah, but that would, if I thought of it that way, that would be more like using
The
her
prop.
in some way.
Right.
I felt like I kept telling myself I really didn't want to have someone like that in the book, but she was essential.
Yeah.
And figuring out sort of why characters are the way they are is one of the things I have the hardest time explaining, because since I don't write about people I know and I don't plan who will be in a book, it has the feeling a little of they're just arriving, which sounds kind of weird. Obviously, we all make things up every night when we dream. There's a kind of organic quality to those imaginings, and I guess in my case, there's, again, a sort of organic quality to who appears and what they do. And I'm just trying to work with that as best I can, but I'm not able to change it sometimes.
Interesting. Okay, there were a couple more here.
Yeah.
Yes?
Here it comes.
Thank you very much. It's really pleasurable to get really deeply into the text of the book. But I wonder if I might just take the liberty of taking one step just outside of the particular book and just talk to you as a writer in among other writers and other writings, and just ask you which other writers have inspired write poetry or read poetry or write it, but also within that environment would be fascinating to hear.
Okay, well, I would say there are kind of two levels of answer. One is just things that have inspired me in deep ways over time that I kind of think of as my literary DNA, and those would be writers like Edith Wharton for sure, Ralph Ellison, Yeats, Shakespeare, hugely. But they're not necessarily people that I'm thinking about actively as I work on individual books. Each book tends to have its own constellation of artists, and sometimes they're visual artists as well, that I'm kind of communicating with, in a conversation with of some sort. So, and that's really different for every book because my books are so different from each other. With A Visit from the Goon Squad, it was very much in search of lost time. And also a lot of epic poetry. Don Juan, Byron's, endless and hilarious epic poem, Pushkin, Dante. I love that stuff. I love storytelling, especially a kind of really driving story force in poetry. And in fact, I tried to write a chapter of A Visit from the Goon Squad in the form of epic poetry, which I'm sorry to say was unsalvageable. So
that could be your next genre.
I think Twitter is as close as I'm going to get to epic poetry, I'm sorry to say. With this book, it was very much, I would say, detective fiction, especially with a sort of noir flavor. So
And
Chandler,
film you talked about.
definitely noir film. Sea stories in a big. Moby Dick is a pole star for this book because Melville lived in New York, writes explicitly about the New York waterfront and the wish of everyone who's in New York to get to the edges of it and be near the water. And Conrad, the great sea writers, and so those were some of the books that I felt like I was sort of in converse. Oh, and another thing, Hilary Mantel's 2 historical novels,
Beautiful. Gorgeous
hugely important. Those I felt that I really kind of studied to understand how she avoided so many of the pitfalls of historical novel writing. One of which is the kind of cheesy scenes in which we're just getting a lot of atmosphere and kind of flavor. She never does that, and it was helpful for me to study her and learn certain things just not to even do. So I guess I would say, noir, sea stories, and Hilary Mantel would be kind of the 3 realms that I was thinking of when I worked on this book.
Good company, one would say. There was another question. Okay, here.
Thank you. First of all, I've read it from cover to cover, including the acknowledgements, and there I saw the richness, the huge research that you've done. I have 2 remarks about that and one simple short question. But first of all, the richness of detail. The research really paid off in the parts about diving, about the waterfall, and the life on the naval yards and the merchant marine, and so on. And in fact, the richness of details of it, that you expressed a certain doubt about it, I must say that was part of the pleasure for me, and it reminded me very much of what you just mentioned with Melville and Moby Dick, which has parts that is also very descriptive.
Thank
however,
you.
There's another part of the book that's about the mobsters, the gangsters, that lively organization. I saw there's very little research on that. Maybe it is because you're familiar with it, or it's just your imagination, I don't know.
Does he know something that the rest of us don't know?
Well, the truth is, I wish I could have found mobsters who wanted to talk to me about their work. It's a little harder than with some other jobs. The truth is that I did read some very useful books, and I also, fiction was very helpful as well, although a lot of it was kind of genre-esque. I felt a kind of kinship in a way with that world of sort of crime and law enforcement a little bit because of my own family. My grandfather was a police officer and then a commander on the south side of Chicago. And he used to tell a lot of stories. I mean, when I was listening to these stories and when he was letting me hold his gun, he was, we are Americans after all. He was, a white-haired, friendly guy who used to say, "Isn't that nice?" all the time. But when you see pictures of him, he looked pretty stern. He was
It's a little less nice.
Yeah, he was a real clothes horse. He really was a fancy dresser, and he and his partner used to be bodyguards for Truman when he was a senator, and then still when he was a president. So there are a lot of great pictures of my grandfather in his fedora with Truman and with my grandfather's partner, having a great time, laughing and all kinds of things. So. And then in that part of the family, I have a sister who worked for the Department of Justice, and my father's brother was a criminal defense lawyer. So sitting at a table with them, you hear a lot about gangs and mobsters. You may know that Chicago is a rather corrupt city in a rather corrupt state. So there's a lot of interaction between criminal life and politicians and law enforcement. And so I feel like I have a sense of a lot of that just from those conversations. But there were some books that were actually very important, and I did acknowledge a couple of them. One is called Paddywhacked. It's kind of a frivolous title. I mean, in fact, it's a very scholarly look at how a lot of the pathologies that afflicted Irish American culture in America originated from the oppression that they underwent by the British, and how a lot of their sort of criminal activity and corruption in America was a response to that. And he also talks about the rivalry between...
that would be interesting to look at
today. It is.
But for
and how the rivalry
issues.
between Irish and Italian people who, the Irish were, very racist and regarded the Italians as a different race. So the other thing was I did a lot of reading about prohibition and its impact on organized crime, which was essentially, of course, liquor was illegal in America from 1919 to 1933. And what that meant, since everyone still wanted to drink, was that organized crime, as we know it today, got organized to go into the liquor business, and they made a fortune. And the gangster figure became kind of acceptable in mainstream society because he was the one bringing the booze. And that acceptability was something that lingered even after Prohibition ended. And at that point, the mob, criminals of all sorts, got involved in a way things that were much less savory to mainstream culture to try to make up the income stream they lost when Prohibition ended. So there was a fair amount of research in all this.
She hung out at nightclubs a lot. It was, okay, maybe one or two.
Mr. Q is Dexter Stiles' boss, a total invention. Although there's so many crazy personalities in the world of organized crime, if you read about it. There was one guy, I'm forgetting his name, but there was a big question, I think in the 90s, about whether he was crazy or not in New York. He was always running around in his pajamas, and no one could figure out whether he was actually crazy or just crazy like a fox. I think they finally determined that it was crazy like a fox, and they locked him up. But the sort of the way in which eccentricity kind of played into his criminality was, I guess, something I had in my mind as I worked on Mr. Q, but I just made him up.
And everyone just putting up with it as part of the... Okay, maybe one last question from the group. I have a last question in terms of the characters. I was thinking of this as a classic book and thinking these characters are just so strong. And if you could imagine an Anna or a Dexter in the future becoming one of these iconic characters that stands for something that people will refer to for generations, a Tom Sawyer or a Joe March or a Holden Caulfield or an Atticus Finch, or so, what would you imagine them symbolizing? What would they be used to refer to?
That's really hard for me to answer. I
Or
don't know.
if you could sketch it yourself.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I will try to answer any question, but I'm not sure. That's one of those things that I think it's a little like the things other people say about you that you don't know about yourself.
Right.
I think somehow as the I wouldn't want to say the inventor of them because it doesn't feel like that, but the conduit for them. I feel unsure, knowing them as I do, what impression they make in that sort of shorthand way.
Right.
I mean, I could find a sort of thumbnail way to describe any of them, but you know, becoming a cultural icon of that sort, like Tom Sawyer or Huck Finn, I'm not sure what makes that happen exactly. It's an interesting question.
Yeah, but why do some? Because there are so many incredibly colorful, strong characters that don't make it.
Yeah.
And then some that do, and it is an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I
We'll
think
have to check in with you in 50 years and see how.
Well, also, I think the truth is that I don't ever think about people as symbolizing anything or really. I would never think of someone as sort of needing to demonstrate something.
No, not in that way, but just as people would refer to them, in a.
Yeah, I guess yeah, because I'm so wary of that sort of what at least if I were imagining them as being iconic in that way, I feel like the danger is that I would be thinking in ways that would lead to a kind of didacticism in the writing, and that is so much the opposite of the kind
Well, that's why we can only talk about it now that the book is done. This is, I think, not something to
No, I
go
just
in.
the sort of fun that I'm always trying to provide, because really my goal is to create a story that is transporting, that makes you lose your bearings, forget your regular life,
And not
miss
teach
your
you
subway
anything.
stop, which
Right.
is a New York thing. And once my mother said she had a lukewarm reaction to something I had read, and she said, "What would satisfy you? Like what are you hoping to have happen?" To someone who reads your work. And I thought about it and I said, I wouldn't mind a call from the hospital. I mean, as long as nothing really bad ended up happening. But I'm just being flippant, but really I just mean that in the end,
So engrossing.
entertainment is my goal.
Yeah.
And what I like in my entertainment is a strong structure of ideas, a kind of relevance, something that feels relevant in the moment, but really that transport, that kind of deliverance out of everyday life is what I crave as a reader.
Well, it definitely worked, at least for me. Can you say 2 words quickly about, the question that writers hate to answer, but I know that you've talked about it in terms of Jennifer seems to have like the next 20 years plotted out in 7 books. There are rumors also that there's going to be a movie made of this book. We were picturing John Hamm as, Dexter stuff. Is that really going to happen?
Oh, who knows? I mean, it seems like it's very rare that anything. My first book actually did become a movie, which gave me the feeling that happens every time. But I realized that was a freakish good luck. I have sold an option, but who knows?
Who knows?
Yeah. In terms of my own plans, I mean, I think it's interesting. I spent so much time talking to people at the end of their lives about the trajectory of their lives that I think it made me think hard about what I want to get done. It was just a natural outcome of that. And so, I have various times and places that feel rich to me. And that's, for me, that means books I want to work on. But what someone else might say, I would call that like a vague notion of a setting. But
that's a starting point.
Some vague notions have a kind of heat about them that makes me think they'll lead somewhere. My favorite dream, which I have again and again in different forms, is that I'm in a familiar place, like an apartment. It's a very New York dream. And I suddenly...
Very small.
I suddenly realized that a wall opens and there are all these extra rooms that I hadn't known about, or gardens. And I think, I have all this extra space. Wow, what am I going to do with this?
Is there a parking spot, garage?
And so it's really a thrilling dream, and I think it's a dream about that feeling that certain locations will lead me into new realms.
Well, we so look forward to seeing those other rooms and where they're going to need you. So thank you so, so much,
Thank you.
Jennifer. and
Thank you all. Am I?
Thank you, Hollis. Thank you, Jennifer, for...
Oh my goodness.
I think you'll be signing more. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Hollis, for leading into these other realms and for giving us something with so much profundity with the label of entertainment. How wonderful. And there are more wonderful John Adams events to come. On the 19th of March, in the same hall, we'll be talking with Howard Dijkgraaf and Pia Jong about their life in the United States. On the 13th of April, another wonderful woman writer from the U.S., A.M. Holmes, is coming to the John Adams, and we're doing an event in collaboration with Toneel van Amsterdam, who has made her book Vergevens dashed into a play, and that will be a combination ticket for our event and for the play with English surtitles. April 24th, something completely different, the Stanford Professor of Virtual Reality, Jeremy Benelson, will be joining us. May 5th, we're doing an event together with I Film Institute, connected with their theme of this spring, 1968, which, to the shock of some of us, is now already 50 years ago. And this event will focus specifically on the Vietnam War. And Glenn Kendall, who is here with us this evening and who leads our book club, will be telling us also that evening about his experience as a Vietnam vet. And finally, not finally at all, for the time being, on May 24th, we have an event in our technology series from the internet critic Andrew Keene. If you'd like to stay up to date on what we do, sign up for our newsletter and help make events like this possible by joining us as a member or as a patron, perhaps even as a friend or a member of our family. And come back soon and bring a friend. And Jennifer will be signing books here on the podium. Thank you for joining us.
Should I sign here?
Tracy, is Jennifer?
Should I be here to sign?
I think they want you here.
Jennifer, the signing is here.
Okay. We'll transport.
Transport.
Do you have a pen?